So gender shaped experiences of slavery at every level. The main defining characteristic of transatlantic slavery or the Atlantic slave trade relative to other forms of slavery that have existed or continue to exist globally was actually a gendered thing. So slavery as the sort of notion of some people being in charge of other people in a really broad kind of context has always existed. We can talk about Roman slavery or Ottoman slavery, or West African slaveries. Lots and lots of societies had those kind of power dynamics. But the main thing that was different about the Atlantic slave trade was that the status of being an enslaved person was hereditary, which meant that if a mother was enslaved, then the child would become enslaved. And so slavery was passed down from one generation to the next. So gender was totally essential because being an enslaved mom mattered to everything that would happen next. So gender is really important in that way. There are other ways that gender is really important also. Gender shaped the kind of labor that people did. So for the most part, although this changed over time, enslaved women and enslaved men would sometimes do different kinds of jobs. Everybody did some similar jobs like agricultural labor, but women did more jobs having to do with reproduction and sexuality, and men tended to do more jobs having to do with like really hard physical labor. In some areas, the kinds of skills that were traditionally gendered on the west coast of Africa were brought across the Atlantic Ocean. So for example, in the Carolinas, in North and South Carolina, during the 1700s and the early 1800s, the main crop there was rice. And on the west coast of Africa, the main people who were responsible for taking care of rice and growing rice were women, which meant that women were the main people who were sort of responsible as enslaved people for growing rice and cultivating rice, and men did other jobs. So the kind of labor that people did was different. And then the other thing is that gender shaped resistance practices. So when we think about slavery, we might think about slave revolts or like fighting back or running away as major ways that people fought back against the system. Gathering with each other and starting a revolt or running away to the north or following the North Star, things that sometimes people think about. All of those things happened, but those things were mostly done by men. Women had to resist in other ways, largely because they were taking care of families and they had responsibilities to their children that men had different relationships to. So women typically did not run away to the north as a mode of resistance. Instead, women on plantations in the U.S. South anyway would often enact something called truancy. So truancy is when an enslaved person would go out into the woods. There's some kind of issue happening on the plantation. Maybe there's not enough food, or a child is sick, or someone's going to be sold away from the plantation. And the enslaved people who worked there are not happy about it. So in protest, instead of running away, an enslaved woman would be much more likely to go into the woods and stay there for a week or two. And she would get help from her friends and from other enslaved people to make sure that she could eat and stay safe. But she would sort of stay there until the plantation owner, the slaveholder, did what she wanted. And then she would come back and she would take care of her kids and, go back to sort of a more normal existence. So women did sort of different things to resist slavery than men did.